Good afternoon, everybody. It is Friday, September 25th, 2020, and welcome to our latest installment of Murray Men on Politics. I'm Keir Murray. I'm joined by Dr. Richard Murray from the University of Houston, who I will at the outset say celebrated a birthday 2 days ago. So happy birthday, Dad, and to all who are listening. I'm sure they will virtually wish you one as well under these circumstances where we cannot celebrate in traditional ways, but another momentous week in the United States of America. Just a few hours after we met last Friday, of course, we got the word of the passing of Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Obviously, just a huge historical event for all kinds of reasons, but coming, 6.5 weeks before the presidential election, obviously makes it even loom larger in our immediate sense of politics. So I think I'd be remiss if I didn't begin by asking what your assessment of her passing is, both in terms of the likely future makeup of the court, as well as how her successor's nomination and confirmation process may or may not affect the presidential election in November.
Well, based on what we've learned in the last 6 days, it looks like the Republicans have coalesced behind the president's desire to move quickly to appoint a very conservative woman, particularly on the issue of choice. The Democrats have very limited tools at their disposal from what I read. I'm not a specialist in Congress, but the Republicans have a 53 vote majority, and they've only had a couple of defections. And they have the spare vote from Pence if there's a tie. So unless something pretty dramatic happens that we're not aware of, it looks like we're going to get a third Trump appointee to the court. It is quite still uncertain from where I sit that the senators on the Republican side are going to push this through before November 3rd. There are a lot of different angles here about how that might play out. But I've noted that our senior Senator, John Cornyn, who of course is in a contested election, has not been particularly eager to have this go forward before November 3rd, because, it could upset a race where he's favored at this point by most standards, but not by much. And so we're not entirely sure, but the process is how it's going to work out. But I'm more comfortable talking about the impact on the race. It seems to me we already have enough information on the presidential level to say this apparently has not changed things much in terms of how public opinion views the race. And that's because, we're a deeply polarized country. Most people have chosen the corner they're in, and there's nothing about this terrible event from the perspective of progressives that's going to change that. Polling now is showing very little movement of voters. Biden's advantage of 7 or 8 points looks like it's persisting. What it has done, of course, is release a shower of dollars that, to the extent we have reporting, we know the Democrats have raised a ton of money, because ActBlue a couple of days ago said $200 million had already been raised for the presidential campaign and various Senate campaigns. And that's, of course, a measure of enthusiasm by grassroots donors. So I don't think it changed the presidential race much. Biden was ahead. He's still ahead. Clock's running. But I think it probably made the Senate races different. In a few instances, it probably helps Republicans, like in Montana, where it's a very Republican state presidentially, but the Democrats have a popular governor running against an incumbent first-term senator. My guess is in that state, it makes the Republican senator in a stronger position, but not elsewhere, particularly a state like Texas, where MJ Hager has struggled to get enough money to raise her name ID and profile. It probably helps her in this state, help her raise money, puts Cornyn on the spot. We have a huge suburban vote that's very much in play. And I think that the politics of this, the loss of a progressive vote on the court, plus hurrying through a quickie appointment, won't play well with these suburban voters. So I think the politics in Texas are very different than the politics in Montana.
Yeah, and I want to follow up on that, because I think when we think about recent ideological battles around Supreme Court confirmations. Obviously, the choice abortion issue comes immediately to mind. It's a lot of those fights have sort of centered around that issue. But what we've seen, it seems to me, from Joe Biden and some other Democrats is the notion of positioning this fight as much about the future of the Affordable Care Act and protection of pre-existing conditions as much as anything else. What do you think about that as a political strategy for the Biden campaign and Democrats running down ballot to position the Supreme Court race or fight over the potential nomination as more about healthcare generally and protecting that ACA as opposed to the choice issue?
I think it's smart politics. The Democrats have the capacity to do a lot of issue research. They concluded in 2017 and 18 that they wanted to recruit candidates that were fit the district, and that meant a lot of moderate candidates, military veterans. And the main issue they wanted to run on was healthcare, and not to spend a lot of time attacking Trump. I think correctly, people know a lot about Trump. They know if they like him or don't like him, and you're not going to change any minds. But on issues like healthcare, this was a wide open field because, as you could call, Trump ran saying he's going to have this great plan, and he never produced it. Meantime, he's trying to get rid of over and over again of the Affordable Care Act. So, there's a big Republican vulnerability there. When you've got a winning issue, why get off of it? It's not as if Americans are less concerned about healthcare in 2020 than they were in 2018, probably au contraire with this virus raging. So sure, abortion is a divisive issue. For most of us, it's an ideological, abstract issue. Very few voters at the moment are contemplating having an abortion or not. Everybody virtually is concerned about healthcare. And, Trump released a very weak tea proposal yesterday that is low on specifics, talks about sending a voucher for $200 for drugs. This is not going to change the direction. Republicans are on the defensive on the issue. And it just so happened that the Supreme Court had scheduled this hearing a week after the election. So particularly if a new judge is confirmed before November 3rd, that night vote will be listening to these arguments and will be voting on healthcare. So it's a very legitimate issue. It's an issue Republicans are playing defense on. So why change?
Yeah, and I've been struck by the number of campaign ads that I've seen both here on Houston area television, but also ads that I've watched, they've been posted on social media and other places on the healthcare issue. And obviously, as you say, many Democratic candidates are running on those issues, including Joe Biden. Most of the ads I've seen from him that have aired here in the Houston area have been healthcare focused. But I'm also struck by the degree to which a lot of Republican incumbents in Congress and legislature and other bodies are running to promote their own records on this issue and to, at least for the purposes of the campaign, project a more moderate persona, more favorable toward protecting pre-existing conditions, toward expanding affordable access to healthcare, et cetera. So I agree. I mean, it does not seem to me that if all these candidates are doing these ads and along a similar track, it suggests they're all getting the same research back, right, from their polls
Sure.
and focus groups, telling them this is what voters are concerned about and what you better be talking about. As long as we're on the presidential campaign, I read a statistic the other day. As I've mentioned before, I follow this site called Medium Buying that tracks spending in presidential and lots of levels of campaigns around the United States. And they produced a chart, I believe it was Medium Buying, that showing that right as of the last couple of weeks, Joe Biden is outspending Donald Trump $6.5 million a day on television versus 200,000 a day nationally. That is a massive gap, particularly for an incumbent president at this juncture in the race. We've seen some speculation that the Trump campaign may be having some cash availability problems. What do you think that means, and how does that affect potentially the race if you're in the remarkable position of having an incumbent president being dramatically outspent on the airwaves down the stretch?
Well, I think as we mentioned last week, Trump had a bunch of grifters working his campaign, and they all got rich, and they didn't leave a lot in the pot down the stretch when you really, really don't want to be badly outspent. There are still according to polls, 6, 7, 8% of the voters that are movable. If one side can advertise across a range of media and the other side can't respond, well, that's just a huge advantage of the persuadable voters down the stretch. So one of the great stories of the 2020 election is the Death Star campaign that the Trump people claim they were putting together. It looks like, like a lot of other things that Trump's been associated with, was just basically BS. Here they are with a faulty campaign operation coming down the stretch, low on money. We already knew from the reports at the end of August, finally get the cash on hand report, that Biden at that point had an advantage of $150 million in cash on hand. Well, that's hugely expanded, almost certainly, here in September. And I think the Biden campaign has the rare luxury of being able to expand the map in whatever way they wish, because they probably are pretty close to saturation in the battleground states, in terms of ad availability. And at some point, you don't get much of a benefit of running a 100th ad in a Denver media market. Denver's no longer a competitive market, but Phoenix is. So it creates the opportunity to make choices about Georgia, Texas, states that probably normally a Joe Biden campaign would not look hard at because of the fact that those are expensive states to campaign in. But if you're sitting on $300 million of extra cash, why not? If unspent money in a presidential campaign is a newspaper that's 2 weeks old, it's worthless. So you want to pour this money on, increase the opportunities to get to 270 across a range of states. And it's an insurance policy. Plus, you can help the Democratic Senate candidates.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is that potentially that spending or lack thereof has implications for down ballot races, right? And not least is things like turnout. If we're in a highly polarized environment, as all survey research suggests, there aren't all that many people who are movable anyway. So a lot of this becomes about motivating your own side. Money helps do that. Even down to just reminding people, here are the days you can vote. Here are the locations. You need to get off the couch and turn out, or mail in your ballot, or whatever it is. But that money can be important in that process, not just at the top of the ticket, but for down ballot effects as well.
Particularly when we've dramatically expanded the voting window in most places. And Trump has shot himself in the foot, or some other more sensitive part of his anatomy on this issue, by ranting and raving about voting by mail, when about half the electorate says they want to vote by mail. And we've got the test case of North Carolina, where Michael McDonald's operation at U.S. Election Project is tracking not only how many ballots have been mailed out, but how many have come back in. That's a critical battleground state. Trump desperately must win it, 15 electoral votes. The last time I looked, there close to 1 million ballots apps have been mailed out, or people requesting. 200,000 ballots have been returned. Those are official votes now. 55% of those ballots in North Carolina come from registered Democrats, 15% from registered Republicans. State's about 50-50 in registration. 30% are with unaffiliated. I mean, if you have money, you've got 40 more days to keep pounding, people send your ballot in, get your ballot. Early voting starting in a lot of places, and if you don't have money, you can't afford to saturate the media markets. So yeah, it's a turnout game for sure. Very few voters are movable. And, the passing of Ginsburg increased the monetary advantage that Democrats have generally.
Yeah, and I'll just add, if you're prosecuting a campaign, if you're running a campaign, managing it from your own perspective, every identified supporter that you get turned out early and in the can is somebody you don't have to spend money on in days ahead. And that allows you as a campaign to narrow your focus onto a smaller pool of voters that either you need to persuade to your side or get to show up. And it reduces expense, right? The more you front load those voters for any campaign's perspective, is something you want to do. So, we got a long way to go in early vote, but it'll be very interesting, I think, to watch how those patterns play out, particularly as gradually we're getting more and more states. I think Georgia now has begun voting early, Virginia this week, voting early, and Texas, of course, on October 13th, will start voting in person, although counties like our own, I think, are in the process of mailing out a couple of 100,000 of the initial mail ballots now. So I agree. It'll be interesting to watch. Before we leave the national stage, the last question I wanted to ask is, we saw in some statements the president made at rallies and other places this week, again, raising this specter of fraudulent election results, not willing to commit to accepting the results of the election, win or lose, seems to have caused some consternation among, watchers, good government types, obviously partisans against the president, even some grumbling among Republicans as well. What do you make of those remarks at this juncture, both vis-a-vis where he sees himself and his prospects in this race, and what it means for what he's likely to do on November 4th?
Well, I think in discussing Trump, we need to keep in mind Michael Gerson, former speechwriter and operative for George W. Bush, that with Donald Trump, there is no past, there is no future. He lives absolutely in the moment. And the moment is, he's very worried about losing the election right now. And I think he's therefore trying to, at one level, provide a psychological excuse for what might turn out to be a substantial drubbing. And if the election is close, gearing up with lawyers and trying to stretch out the uncertainty of the result. But I think it's dumb politics. There are good government types around the country and people who actually have some respect for the rules and the Constitution of the United States. And, by raising this issue and raising it again and again and again, just as people are getting ready to vote, probably doesn't hurt you with your base. Trump very accurately said 5 years ago, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose votes. But not everybody's in the Republican vote base. And I think voters that are more moderate, but not partisan, this is a real turnoff. Plus, it's another day where you're letting it go by without drawing a sharper contrast with Joe Biden, which you need to do, it seems to me. When you're behind, you need to do something to close the gap. And you don't have much time left.
Yeah, and I noted that, I believe it was yesterday, that the Mitch McConnell-led Senate passed a unanimous consent resolution saying basically we're going to follow the rules of, after the election. What's set in the Constitution and set in law is what we're going to do. Again, a symbolic vote to be sure, but I think, trying to send a message that both to the president, but also just to the American public that, we're planning on operating as business as usual. One thing I forgot I did want to mention is obviously the next major thing we've got coming up in the campaign is the first presidential debate, which I believe will be Tuesday or Wednesday evening. I think Tuesday. What do you think about the debate? How does it set up? What are the stakes for each candidate in that debate, and what might its impact be on the race?
Well, first, political science has studied a lot of the debates. The general conclusion of the discipline is they rarely made a major difference. So they get a lot of hype, some of them get lots of viewership, but rarely do they visibly change the trajectory of the race. The Trump side, I think, has much more at stake here. When you're behind and have been behind for 4 months now by a very stable margin, you got to do something to shake the race up. I don't think the passing of Ginsburg has done that or will do it, because it fires up people on both sides. The Trump campaign put a lot of effort early on into trying to define Biden as this old bumbling fool who didn't know where he was at. And of course, Biden's run a pretty solid campaign, maybe helped by the fact that the virus has forced us into a dramatically less than traditional campaign. But this, if they're going to deliver on this case, Trump needs to show something in the debate that he's sharper, more solid with voters, and that Biden's got some big problems. Maybe that'll happen. That's why we have the debate and we'll watch. I think Biden has debated enough over the years, and from my perspective, he's fairly decent, not a great debater, but he has some great benefits. He's basically stuck to the same message the entire year, that he's running as a moderate left of center Democratic candidate. Healthcare is his number one issue. And the personal issue of drawing the contrast is Trump has terribly dropped the ball on the virus in responding to it. And every day you get a reinforcing message known as, we had another 1,000 people die today. So I like the position Biden's in. He can stick to what he's been running on consistently and keep charging Trump with failing to exercise his most important duty, and that's to protect the American people.
Yeah, and I'll just, recalling the honestly painful to watch Democratic primary debates, and they were painful to watch. I thought Biden was not well suited to those multi-candidate formats. He did not perform well in those debates. My sense is he's been stronger in one-on-one matchups. The Bernie Sanders debate comes to mind. I think some people were surprised he did as well as he did, given what had happened previously in those big, multi-car pileups earlier in the primary season. So yeah, it'll be interesting to watch. I do agree with you that I think the president has got to change something right now, and the first debate offers him the best opportunity left on the calendar to do that with enough time to make a difference. I wanted to turn. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, just interesting. Obviously, there's a contrasting style that's great, as well as policy positions. But Trump, is basically not preparing for the debate, and Biden is. And it seems to me Biden has a really big advantage there. He and his team can watch those debates with Hillary Clinton. And Trump is going to be very aggressive, outrageous, tell stories. And you can't count on Chris Wallace to do, but you've got to, as a candidate, respond effectively. And it just seems to be knowing what's coming. You've got to be 2 or 3 points where you can very forcefully confront Trump in a way that Hillary Clinton regretted not doing in her volume about the campaign. And Biden needs to pick a spot or two and very, very strongly draw a contrast between Trump, his manner, his style, and what Biden is trying to do in this campaign. So I like the position Biden's in going in. He might blow it. That's why we'll tune in and watch.
Yeah, and to that end, of course, if you're the campaign and people helping him or helping the president prepare, what you're looking for are those short, clippable moments, statements that crystallize an attitude about the race, an issue, whatever it might be, that media will then take and run with across multiple platforms, and that will potentially live on for 24 to 48 hours. Now, that said, in the Trump era, nothing lives on very long because things change so fast. But historically, you could get 2 or 3 days out of a good soundbite out of a debate like that. So we'll be something to watch for on Tuesday night to see if it happens. I wanted to shift to Texas a little bit. We haven't gotten a lot of attention on the national stage. We seem to be getting another look, is my sense, over the last week or two. We've seen a few polls that have been released, statewide polls. One in the last week, I think, had Biden up 4, one had Trump up 5. There was one with Trump up 3. One this morning from Change Research had Trump up 1. So I think the consensus is, the polling shows Trump has a small lead in the state of a couple of points if you average everything out. Where do you think Texas sits? So we talked about this a week ago, but another week has passed. We've seen no appreciable investment by the presidential campaigns in the state. Lots of investment at the congressional, legislative level, but not yet at the presidential level. Do you think anything's changed in Texas? Do you think the president has solidified his position here? Are we a state that's still up for grabs in November?
I'm in the up for grabs category. The New York Times had a story that included Texas and Georgia and I guess Iowa. In states that they were saying basically these are states Trump shouldn't be in trouble in, but he is in trouble. And more than the other 2 states in the front page article today, our state is chock full of suburban voters. We have one of the largest suburban voting populations in the country. And a lot of those, of course, are suburban women. And what we don't have in Texas is a lot of working class white folks with less than a college education. We also, of course, have a very large Latino population, the largest Black population in the country in terms of total numbers. So I think Trump's in real trouble here, principally because of his huge problem virtually everywhere with suburban women. I remember a race in 1990 when you had a very heavily wealthy Republican candidate, Clady Williams. He had a big lead in the polls, but he managed to blow it because he deeply offended suburban women. So if you look at the Dallas suburbs, he got crushed there. And that killed his race. Ann Richards was elected governor, although she had far less money and had been battered in a brutal Democratic primary. So yeah, it's 26 years later, but I would first look again at those Dallas suburbs. I would look at Collin County, Denton County. Trump could run far below what Republicans normally expect, and that can sink him statewide. Rural small town Texas is deeply, deeply red, but that's 22, 24% of the entire state vote. So, there are a lot of ifs. We don't know yet about level of interest and enthusiasm among Hispanic voters. But one of the things that I think the Ginsburg passing and the dramatization of the court, young voters are overwhelmingly favorable toward the justice that's left us and don't like this process. So I think we may see a surge in younger voting and a coalescing behind the alternative to Trump in Texas and elsewhere.
What do you make of, you mentioned the Hispanic vote, which is obviously a large and growing percentage of the Texas electorate. There's been polling showing weakness with Biden with that community, especially relative to Hillary Clinton. How much of that do you think is real? How much of it, if it's real, do you think is movable before the election if you're Joe Biden? And where do you think the Hispanic vote in Texas ends up in terms of who they support for president?
Texas doesn't have very many Cuban Americans, so that demographic is very important in Florida. It's not relevant here. We're mostly Mexican American with a smattering of Salvadorans and Puerto Ricans and so forth. At the end of the day, I would be surprised if Trump can reach 25% among Texas Hispanics.
Wow.
But I have no idea what the relative level of turnout will be. It's going to be a pretty decidedly Democratic vote. But what's the turnout? And that the benefit that the Democrats have is having resources to try to reach out to that community. In Florida, Biden got a break when Bloomberg came in and said, I'm going to spend $100 million. And a lot of that's being directed, I understand, to Hispanic media outlets and elsewhere. And let's see, it seems to me there's a real opportunity here for the Biden campaign in Texas to do a focused major 30-day program for Hispanic voters, because they're going to do okay in the vote division, but what's the turnout?
So you don't buy some of those, when in some surveys you look at the crosstabs in Texas and you see, Trump capturing 40% of Hispanic voters or somewhere near that, and Biden stuck in the mid-50s. You don't think that's reality?
No. And I think experienced Hispanic academics like Matt Barreto say that's BS. First, exit polls and a lot of surveys taken tilt toward middle-class English-speaking Latinos and don't include a lot of working-class folks whose language at home is Spanish. They're hard to reach, they're difficult to interview, and they're much more democratic than the people you interview. So,
I think also, a lot of times what we see in survey research is that with those harder to reach populations, you end up with a small number of actual interviews, and you end up having to weight the data to bring up those populations to their relative share of the electorate, which can create mirages in polling of all kinds. And so I don't know where we'll end up. I don't know if I believe that Trump will get as low as 25%. I could see 30 or, the low 30s as a distinct possibility, but I would ask people to exercise caution when they look at those crosstabs showing maybe outsized support for the president in communities where both he himself and historically Republicans have not done nearly so well. And again, I'm particularly skeptical in a state like Texas because there's been no investment by the Trump campaign, and not that there has been by the Biden campaign either, but there's been nothing to really change the fundamentals to move people, especially when polling around the country doesn't show any real movement in that regard either. So that's interesting to get your take on that. So we're still mired in some degrees of litigation in the state of Texas, some focused on Harris County, about early voting. One of the things we saw happen this week was the newly anointed Republican Party chair, former Florida Congressman Alan West, joined a number of other current and former conservative office holders in the state in filing suit against Governor Greg Abbott, trying to revoke essentially the extra almost week of early voting that Abbott ordered for the election several months ago. What do you think about that lawsuit? First of all, about its prospects for success with the Texas Supreme Court, where it's likely to end up, and what it says about the campaign and the election in Texas itself.
Well, it's a bad sign when you get a kind of civil war breaking out within your own party. Democrats had a lot of trouble in the 70s when they were still the dominant party. Now Republicans seem to be heading down the same track. First, I think efforts to restrict the opportunity to vote generally don't sit too well with most voters. They like more options. Enough extra 6 days of early voting, I think, is popular. I haven't seen it polled yet with anybody, but so I think we're unlikely, as a non-lawyer, let me say, I think, but somebody who studies politics, it doesn't make a lot of sense for the Supreme Court, who are more or less, on the kind of Abbott side of the Republican divide, to at a late moment say, no, we're going to knock off 6 days of early voting when 4 of them are on the ballot and have credible Democratic opponents. So I think the court will make, as they usually do in these political cases, a sort of thought through move that protects their interest, which is don't shut down voting here a couple of weeks before you're set to start. So I think we'll likely have our in-person early voting kickoff as scheduled by the governor on the 13th of October. And I think that this division within the Republican Party is not helpful at this juncture. We've got a special election, I guess, on 5 days?
It's 29th, I believe, on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Senate
and
District
got an
30
insurgent candidate, this lady who was told to shut down her business and said, basically gave the governor the finger. And, he has his candidate in the race who happened to get the COVID virus, I understand. But let's watch that special election. I mean, in these low vote elections, very fringy Republicans have been winning. And, you've got a safe Republican seat in Western Colorado in Congress, and you had a kind of QAnon fringe candidate knock the Republican out in the primary. And now that's the seat that probably goes Democratic in November. You had a similar fringe win in a Northeast Georgia district, but the district's so Republican, that member's going to Congress. Mm-hmm. But Alan West, Florida Republicans were happy to see him leave. Why are Texas Republicans welcoming this guy with open arms? He's a fringer.
Well, and I've been struck, again, Greg Abbott remains by far the most popular statewide Republican elected official across the board. Still, despite having taken some hits after the COVID virus, still maintains support in the mid-50s among Texans. And in all polls that I've seen, some significant Democratic support or approval ratings. So the notion that you got this new chair of the Republican Party going after somebody on his own side, starting 60 days before an election, when you got a whole bunch of guys on your own side who are in trouble, strikes me as curious, to say the least. I think this fight over the election is just an extension of some of the fight that's gone on over the response to COVID-19. Abbott, I think, has taken fire from right and left on this issue, either for not doing enough or for doing too much. This special election for Senate District 30, Shelley Luther, the salon owner who's running there against Drew Springer, the more establishment Republican state House member from that area, is just an extension of that fight. I agree. I find it very curious. Again, now 5.5 weeks to go before Election Day, when control of the state legislature, one house of the legislature, several congressional seats, and possibly even a few statewide races is potentially at risk. We'll have to see how that plays out. Um, Lastly, I noted that, Dave Wasserman, who works for the Cook Political Report and is a very respected analyst around the country, made a list of suburban counties across America that have been historically quite Republican, and that he thinks are counties to watch for change this November. And there are three Texas counties on that list: Collin County, Tarrant County, and Williamson County. Now, Williamson, we know, went for Beto O'Rourke in 2018, but I don't think, it's sort of considered solidly in one camp or the other at this point. What do you think about those counties, and what, Wasserman picking those counties, why, and why that's important for Texas and its electoral prospects?
Well, I've given a lot of talks around in the last few weeks, and I consistently say, if you're watching one county in Texas, watch Collin County. It's the biggest suburban county in the state, and it's in a very rapid change mode in terms of population makeup. One of the biggest factors there is a dramatic increase in Asian Americans, the largest group of whom are Asian Indians. That's kind of similar to Fort Bend County. Remember, Fort Bend made a dramatic U-turn in 2016 and went from being a safe Republican county in the last 8 presidential elections to all of a sudden Trump loses it, and not close. And then Beto O'Rourke wins it by an even bigger margin. Collin was close in 2018. I think Cruz got 52% there. Beto O'Rourke got 48, but that was far better than any Democrat had ever performed. I think Trump likely loses that county. And, it has 1.2 million people. That puts him in danger of losing the state. Denton County is somewhat similar, slightly smaller, but a huge county with 900,000 people. And of course, Tarrant is the last big urban central county where Republicans were strong, but they lost the county in 2018, not by much, but it's no longer a red county. It's very much now, purple, but the trend line in Tarrant County is similarly, so that if Beto gets 51%, Trump could get be cut to 44 or 45. So we have more suburban voters of any swing state. I mean, California has more, but they're not competitive. So I think Wasserman is right. These are the counties I'm watching. It does matter the margins you run up in Travis County and Dallas County and Harris County. They're going to be huge. But if Republicans can get anything approaching their normal share in the big suburban counties, they've got enough strength then in the rural areas to carry the state. But if they also are losing the suburban counties, stick a fork in them.
Yeah. And then, of course, as we know, in those areas, you have congressional seats and legislative seats that are underneath the presidential race in those counties, where a lot of the battles are being fought in individual races in Texas. I noted the 3rd congressional district centered in Plano, for example, is one that has come out of nowhere onto the watch lists by national analysts. Again, it was a hugely Republican congressional district as recently as 6 or 8 years ago. And now polling that's come out shows us, Van Taylor, former legislator, is the new congressman there after the previous one left. And then a woman, Lulu Cycli, is running. I think we mentioned this last week, but, she's tied in a race that nobody would have given the time of day to, for example, in 2016. And
in watching political change, I'm reminded of this story in The Sun Also Rises, Ernest Hemingway's 1926 novel, when some characters asked Mike Campbell, the friend of Lady Brett, Mike, how did you go broke? And he said, well, slowly at first, and all of a sudden. That's sort of the way political change comes. Usually there's some indicators that things are changing, but it's just a little bit. And then all of a sudden, and that's what happened to the California Republicans. They went from being, pretty comfortable that they had a position that would last for another 10 or 20 years. And then all of a sudden they can't win an election. So,
well, and years later, or years before, of course, here in Texas, on the other way, when I think it was John Tower won a U.S. Senate seat, right? Or if I'm not remembering that correctly, but it was sort of the first breakthrough of many to come, right? And
yeah, it was considered a fluke, but it wasn't. It was an omen of what's coming. And the Texas Democrats didn't respond particularly well, let us say. But Texas is no longer like it was in the 60s or 70s. We have a far, far larger number of Hispanics, a growing Asian population, steady increase in blacks, and tragically, Anglos of my generation, I shall not mention the birthday I just achieved, we ain't increasing in numbers. I read the obits.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I noted along that line that I've taken a look through the voter file at the electorate from 2018, and by my calculation, that's the first time in Texas that the electorate fell under 70% white, went down to 68%. And my guess is in a presidential year, it's going to be more like 65%. And there, then if you're a Republican candidate who's heavily reliant on Anglo voters to carry you over, you have less room for error. And if you're a candidate on the Democratic side who doesn't do particularly well with white voters, you don't need to get as many of them as you did previously to have the prospects of being successful. So it's going to be, I think that coupled with all the things you've described is everything to me points to a very close outcome statewide, at least for president. Down ballot may be a bit different, but I think Trump may carry the state, but if he does, it will not be by much. It will just be by a couple of points, and it could go a couple of points the other way to Biden, it seems to me. We're in that very narrow range in Texas of possible outcomes. Maybe I'll be mistaken about that, but seems to be from where I sit what's going to happen.
One of the things just to mention to our audience today, we get our vote in real fast. Because most of us vote before Election Day, and we count the Election Day ballots pretty quickly. So this story that has been widely covered by the media that we'll never know, it'll be weeks or whatever. Well, not if states like Texas and Florida that are early count states. We pretty much know by 10 or 11 o'clock, as in the Beto Cruz race, a close race, but we could see where it's going to turn out by 10:30 or 11. And that'll be the case in the presidential race. So we're a good state to watch on election night because we get a huge dump of votes after 7 o'clock. And if it's decisive one way or the other, we'll know.
Yeah. Had one question from a viewer asking, is there going to be straight ticket voting this time? No. This is the first election in decades where there will be no more straight ticket voting. That was a change that was passed by the legislature 2 or 3 sessions ago that goes into effect for the first time this year. So what that kinds of implications that has for down ballot are going to be closely watched. I think it will clearly have some implications of people dropping off, not voting all the way down. How much remains to be seen. But there will be no straight ticket voting in Texas, which also, as we've discussed, will lengthen the time it takes people to vote in the polling place if they're voting in person.
Yeah. But behaviorally, a lot of people didn't choose the straight ticket lever. About 65% in Harris County usually do straight Republican, straight Democratic. But among the other 35%, most of them do go all the way to the bottom of the ballot. And basically, they're using pretty behaviorally straight ticket. They're just going in every race, voting for the D or for the R. And I think that's what we'll see. Party loyalties are so deep now, and in big urban counties with lengthy ballots, once you get below the high visibility races for, president, Senate, maybe your congressional, and maybe an occasional high visibility down ballot race, like for county commissioner, people are just voting their party.
Yeah. I think that's going to wrap it up for our sort of prepared discussion. If there are any additional questions, just submit them in the chat here shortly. If you can type fast, we'll try to get to it before we sign off for the week. But again, another extraordinary week in American history. We don't seem to be wanting for those these days.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy your weekend, and we will try to be back with you next time. Bye-bye. And Dad,
Thank you both.
Okay, we're staying on for Kent.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to that.
Okay.